Today we're going to continue section 1.1 of the McCloskey book, Scarcity and the Budget Line. And we're going to talk about three things today. The first thing we'll talk about is the concept of scarcity yet again, but we'll generalize it to two dimensions. Next we'll talk about the concept of budget lines. And finally, we'll talk about the difference between relative price and absolute price. So, let's get started by talking about the concept of scarcity in more than one dimension. Now, last time, when we wanted a visual representation of scarcity, we simply drew a single axis on which one point, say this axis is for books, one point was denoted as the limit of what you could buy due to books being scarce. So everything to the right is not possible. Everything to the left is possible. So in one dimension, we draw simply a single axis. In two dimensions, we're going to be drawing two axes. So we'll draw the usual Cartesian plane, that's the usual graph. We'd say now apples here on one axis and books on another axis. And this curve represents the limit of what kind of bundles you can buy. So everything inside the curve is possible. Everything outside the curve is not possible. And on the curve, on the curve is possible. Now, there are some assumptions that we are going to make on this curve, which we call the budget curve, or as you will see from our first assumption, we will call the budget line. So the first assumption that we make is that that curve, instead of being amorphous, is simply a line. And the main reason we do this is because it's much easier to deal with analytically without sacrificing much, if any, economic intuition. The second assumption we're going to make is that more is better than less. So let's see what this means when we put these two assumptions together. We have apples on one axis and books on another. And here's our budget line. So what we're going to find is that a person, when faced with this budget constraint, would never choose this point. And the reason is, since all of these points are possible, and we're assuming that more is better than less, a person would never choose this point because they're always able to get more in this direction and more in this direction. So what this means is that a person is always going to choose along the budget line. So when we do more analysis of these budget lines in this talk and in the future, most of the time, unless otherwise stated, we're only going to have to consider choices along the budget line. Now that we have a solid understanding of the assumptions that we make on our budget line and the implications of these assumptions, we can go back to a previous topic, opportunity cost, and consider how opportunity cost is incorporated back into the budget line. So, as you might remember from last time's lesson, opportunity cost is the next best choice you could have made. So if I have a choice between an apple and an orange, and I choose to have an apple, my opportunity cost is the orange. So now we have two budget lines, a black budget line and a purple budget line. So suppose I am faced with the black budget line, and I am at the bundle 3-3. Okay? What is the opportunity cost of acquiring one more ton of all other goods? Pause the video here and try to answer this question on your own. Okay, so hopefully you put some thought into it. And this is a pretty easy question, and it's very easy to see on the budget line what the opportunity cost is. So I'm starting out at 3.3, and I want one more ton of all other goods. So remember, because of our assumptions, we're assuming that we're going to move along the budget line. All choices are made on the budget line. So when I want one more ton of all other goods along the budget line, I give up one book. So the opportunity cost of 1 ton of all other goods is 1 book. Now consider again the bundle 3.3. And suppose I'm still on the black budget line. What is the opportunity cost of acquiring 3 more books? Well, we can simply move right along the budget line to 3 more books over here, and we can see that we have to sacrifice 3 tons of all other goods. Now, let's think about this same question, but suppose instead that I am faced with the purple budget line. So I am still at 3.3, and we want to think about what the opportunity cost is of acquiring 3 more books. So I simply move along the budget line 3 horizontal units to the right there, and I see that I have to sacrifice 1 unit of all other goods. So we've seen that the opportunity cost of acquiring 3 more books when faced with the black budget line is 3 tons of all other goods, and when faced with the purple budget line, the opportunity cost is 1 ton of all other good. So what this suggests is that when the budget line has a greater slope in absolute value terms, the opportunity cost of acquiring more of the good on the x-axis is greater. I want to point out that since we have assumed that we have linear budget lines, it's going to be the case that at any point along the budget line, the opportunity cost of acquiring an additional unit of books is always going to be the same. However, if we don't have a linear budget line, that need not be the case. For example, we could have a budget line of this form, which has 2 linear segments with a corner right here. So along this line, the opportunity cost of acquiring more books is less than the opportunity cost along this segment. So now we've covered pretty much everything you need to know about opportunity cost in the budget line. So we can talk about a related concept now called relative price. But before talking about relative price, it's important to contrast it with absolute price. Absolute price is the supermarket price. So you go to the supermarket and you want to buy apples. And apples cost $2 per pound of apples. And you want to buy oranges, and oranges cost $4 for a pound of oranges. Now, this gets contrasted with relative price. Relative price tells us how much of one good we need to give up in order to get a unit of another good. So say we wanted to find the relative price of apples in terms of oranges. So if we want to get 1 unit of apple, how many oranges do we have to give up? So I want you to pause now and answer the question of how many oranges I have to give up to get 1 unit of apple. Or in other words, what is the relative price of apples in terms of oranges? Let's now do the calculation. So I'm just going to write again. It's $2 per pound of apple, and it's $4 per pound of orange. So to find the relative price of apples in terms of oranges, what we have to do is divide the absolute price of apples by the absolute price of oranges. So we'll stick a bar between them and then just do the calculation, making sure to keep all our units correct. So this is equal to $2 over $4 times pound of orange, pound of apple. So we can cross out a lot of our units here. Pounds and pounds cross off, and dollars cross off. So what we are left with is 1/2 orange per apple. This right here is the relative price of apples in terms of oranges. Now that we've talked a bit about relative price, we can try to apply it in a more difficult question. So on this graph, we have 2 budget lines for a given consumer, one in 1984 and the other in 1985. So the first part of the question asks, in which year is the relative price of books in terms of clothing higher? And the second question is, which budget line does the consumer prefer? So let's stop here and try to answer this question. Let's start by answering the first question. To answer this question, we need to figure out the relative price in 1984 and the relative price in 1985. Now earlier, we talked about how the slope of a budget line measures the opportunity cost of getting more books in terms of clothes. However, the opportunity cost of getting more books in terms of clothes is exactly the relative price of books in terms of clothes. So in order to figure out in which year the relative price of books in terms of clothing is higher, we simply need to figure out in which year the slope of the budget line has a greater absolute value. And that is obvious. In 1985, the budget line is sloped much steeper than in 1984. So to answer the first question, the relative price of books in terms of clothing is higher in 1985. To answer the second question, just put yourselves in the shoes of a consumer. So, while the relative price of books in terms of clothing is higher in 1985 than in 1984, everything that is possible in 1984 is also possible in 1985. In addition, there is an entire region which is not possible in 1984, but is attainable in 1985. So, because a consumer always wants more choices to less, a consumer would prefer the budget line in 1985, even though the relative price of books in terms of clothing is higher in 1985. With that, we've finished all the material in section 1.1. So for next week, I want you to read all of section 1.1, do exercise 6, problems 1 through 3, and true or false questions 7 through 9. Next week, we'll be getting started on section 1.2, income in the budget line. I'll see you then.